Steel jaws close around a wrecked 1973 Corvette. The hydraulics start their slow crush. Somewhere in that scrapyard, a high school shop teacher and one of his students are watching, and one of them is about to stop the machine before it finishes the job. That car became the strangest Corvette ever put on film. It's right-hand drive. It has a nose that opens like a clamshell, years before any factory Corvette would. It's finished in a paint job that looks lit from inside, and for decades, almost every account of what happened to it afterward has gotten the ending backwards, including, until this research pass, this one. This is the real story of Kenny's Corvette, from the crusher through a 4-month build most people have never heard the details of, to 2 real cars on 2 different continents, and a replica that actually made it to a Barrett-Jackson auction block. By the summer of 1977, Mark Hamill wasn't just another young actor. He was Luke Skywalker, fresh off the biggest film of the decade, and MGM wanted him for something much smaller and much stranger, a coming-of-age story about a car-obsessed high school senior named Kenny Dantley, who leads his shop class in restoring a wrecked Corvette Stingray, only to have it stolen the night the class finally finishes it. The production almost didn't keep its name. Contemporary trade coverage shows MGM had registered the title Stingray with the Motion Picture Association, but an independent production scheduled to release first forced a change. First to the working title Corvette, then finally to Corvette Summer that spring. It's a small detail, but it says something about how much weight the studio was putting on the car itself as the selling point, before a single frame had been shot. Filming ran roughly 34 days, almost entirely on location, Newhall, California standing in as the fictional high school town, with additional work at Burbank and Verdugo high schools and an auto body shop in Vernon. One of the more demanding shoots was the sequence where Kenny first drives the finished Corvette through the San Fernando Valley, reportedly a difficult shoot even by the standards of a production built around a hero car. The plot itself is B-movie material through and through. After the Corvette is stolen, Kenny hitchhikes toward Las Vegas chasing a tip on its whereabouts, and along the way meets Vanessa, played by Annie Potts, a self-described prostitute trainee hustling her way through the same city. Potts's performance actually earned her a Golden Globe nomination, a rare bit of critical recognition for a film that otherwise landed as a punchline. There's also a late twist where Kenny's own shop teacher turns out to be connected to the car's theft, which undercuts the mentor figure setup from the opening act. None of it aged particularly gracefully. Dusty Springfield's music turns up on the soundtrack, and the film's cultural afterlife includes a stray joke in a 1994 episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. Luke, join me or you'll star in Corvette Summer, which by itself tells you where the movie's reputation had settled a decade and a half later. The film cost roughly $1.7 million and pulled in $36 million at the box office, a hit by budget standards, a footnote by prestige standards. Critics were unkind, audiences mostly moved on, but the car did not get forgotten the way the movie did. 40-plus years later, people who have never seen a single frame of Corvette Summer can pick that Corvette out of a lineup on sight, from a photograph, from a die-cast replica, from a single glimpse of that nose. That's unusual. Most movie cars fade out with their films. This one somehow outlived its own picture's reputation. This channel exists to get stories like this one right. Not the version that's been copy-pasted for 40 years, but the one the paperwork actually backs up. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing means you don't miss the next one. The car at the center of the story starts life as a real rear-ended 1973 Corvette Stingray. Some accounts place it directly inside an operating car crusher when the production found it. Others simply describe a totaled car pulled from a junkyard. Either way, it was a write-off before anyone in Hollywood touched it. It went to Dick Korkes and his team at Korky's Kustom Studios, and what came back roughly 4 months later barely resembled a Corvette. The nose became a full clamshell, the entire front clip, hood and fenders together, hinging upward from the bumper in one piece to expose the engine. That wasn't just a showy party trick for the camera. No production Corvette would get a clamshell front end as a standard factory feature until the C4 arrived, years down the line. Whether the crew at Korky's knew they were previewing a design language Chevrolet hadn't built yet, or simply needed the most dramatic possible way to open a hood for a camera crew, isn't documented anywhere. But the coincidence is real, and it's part of why the car reads as strangely forward-looking underneath all the 70s excess. The rear got its own custom treatment, a reworked fiberglass tail section built around an oversized Chevrolet bowtie emblem, lit and detailed like a piece of jewelry rather than a production taillight housing. It's the kind of detail that takes real fabrication time and doesn't show up in most custom builds of the era, which tended to spend their effort up front and treat the rear as an afterthought. The paint went on the old way, layer after layer of translucent lacquer, reportedly somewhere between 6 and a dozen coats depending on the account, built up over a gold flake base into a shifting red and gold finish that looked like it was on fire under the right light. It's genuinely one of the more technically demanding paint jobs applied to a movie car in that decade, and it looked it. It was also fragile by design. That kind of buildup doesn't hold up to weather, UV, or decades of storage the way a modern base coat clear coat system would, which is worth knowing for anyone chasing period accuracy today. Then there's the detail everyone remembers first, even people who've forgotten the plot entirely. The car is right-hand drive. Not a factory configuration, these were standard US spec Corvettes, converted using a custom chain-link drive setup to relocate the steering to the passenger side. Multiple accounts trace the reasoning back to something almost throwaway in the script. It let Kenny pull up close to the sidewalk and talk to girls walking by without leaning across the car. A gag line, essentially, written to solve a single scene. It became the single most identifiable thing about the vehicle. Nobody set out to make that the legacy, it just was, and it stayed that way for 45 years. By some accounts, Hamill himself needed time to adjust to driving the reversed layout for his own scenes, which tracks. American drivers don't get much practice with a right-hand cockpit in a left-hand traffic country. Under all of it, the clamshell nose, the fire and gold paint, the reversed cockpit, the car kept its stock drivetrain, an L48 350 small block V8 rated around 190 horsepower, running through a 3-speed automatic badged a little generously as a Turbo 350. No actual turbocharging involved, GM's marketing team just liked the name. All show, minimal go, which is standard practice for a movie car built to be photographed rather than raced. The engine was never the point of this build, and nobody involved pretended otherwise. Finished off, the car also reportedly carried custom moonroof-style T-tops, side pipes routed through the bodywork rather than underneath it, and a set of aggressive turbine-style wheels to complete the look. Those 3 details show up consistently across enthusiast retellings, but I couldn't verify them against anything closer to a primary source. Treat them as likely, not confirmed, the same way you'd treat any detail that's been repeated so often it started to sound like fact by sheer repetition. 2 identical cars were built to this exact spec, both 1973 base models, both right-hand drive, both finished by Korky's team. One was the Hero car, built and maintained specifically for close-up work, the version audiences actually studied on screen. The other was the Stunt car, built to absorb the abuse of the driving sequences, including the aggressive scenes the Hero car was never meant to survive. That distinction, which car did what, matters enormously for what comes next, because it's the exact detail almost every retelling of this story gets backwards, including, again, the version this research started from. Beyond the 2 builds, the Hero car did double duty as a promotional tool. It made appearances during the film's publicity run, including reported stints on display to help sell the picture before it even opened. A reminder that in 1978, the car really was doing more marketing work than the plot summary could. Here's what actually happened, cross-checked against multiple independent sources that agree with each other and consistently disagree with the commonly repeated version. The Hero car, the close-up car, the one people picture when they picture this Corvette, was sold after filming to a private collector in Australia. It didn't stay frozen in its screen-accurate form. In the 1980s, it was extensively reworked by local custom builders, reportedly Paul Kelly and Paul Bennett, restyled into something that diverged noticeably from how it looked on film, and eventually earned a magazine cover on Street and Strip. After years out of public view, it resurfaced again in 2015 at Australia's MotorX show, giving the car a second act nobody in 1978 would have predicted for it. The Stunt car, the one that took the driving abuse, stayed in the United States. It ended up in the collection of Mike Yeager, founder of Mid-America Motorworks, on display at his facility in Effingham, Illinois, and making periodic appearances at car shows for years. It's now believed to be in New Zealand based on the most recent reporting available. Say that back the other way, hero car to New Zealand, stunt car to Australia, and you have the version that keeps circulating, the one repeated in enough places that it starts to feel like settled fact. It isn't. The paperwork trail, Wikipedia's own cited sourcing, contemporary collector accounts, and independent automotive write-ups all consistently land on the opposite pairing. Somewhere along the line, someone swapped the two cars in the retelling, and the mistake outran the correction. There's one more piece of the record worth mentioning. An original mold taken from the film car was displayed for years at the Corvette Americana Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, and is now part of the permanent collection at the National Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky. It isn't a drivable car, but it's the closest thing to an original artifact that stayed on U.S. soil in a public collection. Everything else genuinely left the country. Neither surviving car is in the United States today. Both are, as far as the public record shows, still in private hands on opposite sides of the Pacific, closer to each other geographically now than either one is to where it was actually built. There is no version of this car you can currently buy that's the real thing. Both movie cars are accounted for, both are overseas in private collections, and neither has surfaced for public sale in recent memory, which means anyone chasing this build today is chasing a tribute, not a survivor. That tribute market does exist, and it's better documented than you'd expect for a one-off movie prop. A partial replica, built on a 1972 base Corvette, got the clamshell hood right, but skipped the custom bow tie rear treatment entirely, ran standard side pipes instead of the through body setup, and never quite matched the original paint or pinstriping. It's an honest tribute car, sold as one, never passed off as the real thing. The Volo Auto Museum picked it up via eBay in 2007 for $30,000. It later went to Barrett Jackson's Scottsdale option in 2016, consigned through Gas Monkey Garage, Richard Rawlings' shop, better known for fast and loud builds than movie car tributes, and sold at no reserve. A commonly cited hammer price of roughly $15,000 circulates online, but it isn't independently confirmed against a verified auction record, so treat that number as reported rather than settled. For anyone actually pricing out this build today, the realistic starting point isn't hunting for a lost movie car, it's sourcing a clean, base model 1973 Corvette Stingray and building outward from there. A base 73 in solid driver condition is a known quantity in the market, well documented, without the premium that a more desirable big block or numbers-matching example would carry, which actually works in a builder's favor here, since none of what made this car famous came from the drivetrain. From that starting point, the real cost and time sink is the fabrication, the clamshell hood conversion, a fabricated Chevrolet emblem rear treatment, and a period-accurate multi-coat lacquer finish that's genuinely high maintenance by design and won't tolerate being treated like a modern base coat clear coat job. The right-hand drive conversion is its own specialist undertaking, not a bolt-in kit, and not something most general restoration shops will have done before. Worth being honest about, too. The details with the least documentation, the T-tops, the side pipes, and the specific wheel choice, are exactly the ones a builder is most likely to get slightly wrong, because there's no confirmed reference to build against. Replicating a movie car this obscure often means replicating an educated guess as much as a documented spec, and that's not a knock on anyone who's built one. It's just the reality of working from second-hand accounts of a prop nobody kept full records on. A wrecked Corvette gets pulled out of a crusher. It gets built into something no factory would recognize, sold twice over to 2 different continents, and somewhere in the retelling, even that last part gets scrambled. The 2 cars swapped so often the mistake starts to look like the record. The Corvette survived all of it. The story about where it actually went almost didn't.